And anybody who thinks IT general controls are just about a SOX compliance audit and it's just about the financials and is it material or not, spare me, dude. Look at what has just happened. This is clearly an immediate operational risk, and that's where you need to start thinking about how IT general controls work, or they don't.
Hello and welcome to Off the Books, where we surf the uncharted waters of accounting, finance, risk, and wherever else the waves take us. This episode is brought to you by Workiva, the platform for assured integrated reporting. There's nothing else like it, like a snowflake that falls on a fingertip that's in the shape of a unicorn. I'm your host for today, Off the Books producer and recovering cherry coke addict Mike, and I'm delighted to be debating a great conversation with you. With me, as always, there's Steve Soder and Catherine Sy. Steve, over to you.
I'm Steve Soder, accounting enthusiast and Diet Coke aficionado. Looking forward to debating, as always, a great conversation. Catherine?
I'm a professional asker of questions, and I like to drink venti soy chais, and I think that's it.
Are you also looking forward to debating a great conversation?
Sure,
Mike and I are debating the heck out of a great conversation
We're
right
going to
now.
debit it.
Okay.
That's right.
Hop on this debit train because it's leaving the debit station.
Okay.
In today's episode, which is the start of a week-long mini-series. That's right, you're going to get a small off-the-books episode in your feed every day this week. We are starting with a repeat guest. We are at Amplify, our annual conference. You heard our big Amplify episode a couple weeks ago, and now we're here to do a slew of conversations that run the gamut of topics. So, Steve, who are we talking to today?
Well, we talked to recurring guest Matt Kelly. He's the man behind the newsletter Radical Compliance. I say this every time we talk about Matt Kelly, but it shows up on Friday afternoons. It is informative, it is witty, it is free. Nothing to lose there, so would definitely recommend our audience go subscribe. And we talked to Matt about a whole bunch of things. We talked about the SolarWinds issue and what that has actually meant for kind of enforcement on what might seem like related issues, but actually aren't related issues. We talk about CrowdStrike, and we talked a lot about what organizations ought to be thinking about when it comes to cyber threats and third-party risks. It was a really good conversation, and I think we actually got Matt a little bit wound up, which is not easy to do.
I was going to say, his past appearances, he's pretty laid back, and he's fired up today's episode.
That's right.
Can't wait to re-listen.
Let's do it now. Matt Kelly, thank you so much for joining us once again at Amplify. To kick us off, can you remind our listeners, who are you? What's your deal?
Sure. So I am the publisher of a newsletter, Radical Compliance, that follows corporate audit and compliance and risk management issues. Been doing that for about 10 years. I've been writing about these things for 20 years, a little bit more than that. And most importantly, I've been coming and crashing the Workiva annual conference at least since, I think, 2013 was the first one I went to. Yes.
You are a familiar face around the halls of Amplify, and we love it, by the way.
It's always one of my go-to events. It's very good, very informative, and the food and the parties are also top-notch.
Well, while we're talking about top-notch, you know I am going to plug the newsletter. I get it on Fridays. You know that I respond, especially when there's like an SEC thing. Would highly recommend it for our audience. One of the things that we were really interested in talking to you about is the SolarWinds internal accounting controls debacle, fiasco, however we want to call it. Do you mind, as kind of simple as you can, sort of break down what happened, but then importantly, what that means for kind of like where we're at? Because we're in a weird spot.
Sure. So for anybody who is worried about cybersecurity and internal controls, IT general controls, the SolarWinds case is something that you should have on your radar and pay a close attention to. The SolarWinds case, the name might ring a bell for some people. The breach happened in 2020. SolarWinds was a IT services firm, they're still around, and they sell software to large corporate organizations, government agencies, Fortune 500, college campuses and whatnot, sell software to help you manage your IT systems better. In 2020, they were attacked by the Russian operatives who implanted spyware into SolarWinds product that it then pushed out to all of those corporate customers. And this led to a gigantic breach at the end of 2020. In 2023, the Securities and Exchange Commission then sued SolarWinds on two grounds. They said, number one, you had poor disclosure of controls because you had said for years that your cybersecurity practices were awesome and safe and secure, And they published a security statement on their website saying as much. But internally, far down the org chart, the IT security developers were saying, this is not true. We are nowhere near what we're telling investors. So that was a misleading disclosure, the SEC said. Lawsuit prong number 1. Lawsuit prong number 2 was also that the SEC said SolarWinds had poor internal accounting controls because under the SEC rules, strong internal accounting controls are supposed to assure that assets are used according to management's wishes. Well, clearly, if the Russians are getting in and accessing your IT software and your software code, which is a corporate asset, well, therefore, SolarWinds, you didn't have strong internal accounting controls because the assets were not used according to management's wishes. That was the setup of the case in those 2 prongs, and they filed suit against SolarWinds and its CISO personally. And then, earlier this summer, in July, a federal judge finally ruled that no, SEC, you cannot use the internal accounting controls to enforce poor cybersecurity controls. This language was drafted in the Roosevelt administration. You cannot stretch it to say, therefore, it should apply to your VPN and your secure software development. That part knocked out. Although the disclosure controls and the issues there, that part still live.
Interesting. Very interesting. And I will admit, to me, that felt like a little, I don't know if I'd call it a stretch, but as we think about like safeguarding of assets and that kind of thing, we're generally talking about cash, inventory, like those kind of things. Where does this lead us? Where does this lead us now?
Well, I think it leads us to a not good place. And I struggle with this because I see the judge's point. They are not wrong to say accounting controls are about accounting, which is about money and accounts. It is not about cybersecurity, SEC. Nice try, but no. It's hard to argue with that. However, we should also keep in mind, if you look at what happened with SolarWinds from an internal controls perspective, all of the victims there, basically, they were accepting software updates from a third party without testing that software patch. That's what the SolarWinds breach was, really. They pushed out a software upgrade, and everybody said, sure, implement it, and they didn't test it first. Well, that is poor IT general controls. So in theory, all of these victims should therefore have then disclosed in their next 10K or 10Q, well, we have a material weakness in our IT controls. Now, newsflash, the number of people who actually did that was somewhere between 0 and 0. But what gets to me is that 1 week after the judge made this reasonable ruling that no, you can't use internal accounting controls to enforce cybersecurity, we also had that disaster with the CrowdStrike breach. Well, it wasn't even a breach, this CrowdStrike failure where CrowdStrike, a cybersecurity firm, pushed out a software upgrade that had an error in it. This was not a hack. This was not the Russians or the Chinese or anybody else. They just had bad code that they pushed out to all of these corporate customers, which caused the largest IT outage in history. Thousands of companies around the world, major airlines that could not have their planes get in the sky for days.
I was stuck in London Heathrow, actually, when that happened.
Yes, and this is not an uncommon thing. So I live in Boston, where the largest hospital we have, Mass General, they had to scrub surgeries that patients needed because they couldn't use the software to schedule these things. This had real-world impact. But think about what happened here. 4 years after the SolarWinds breach, which was IT updates that nobody tested, they just implemented from an outside party, we had thousands of companies implement a software upgrade from a third party that they didn't test. This was the exact same IT control failure. And at this point, we all knew this sort of thing could happen because we saw it in the news. So therefore, all of these companies should already have had effective internal controls, and they didn't because they had these disasters. But what gets me in how these two cases are connected is now a judge has said, SEC, you can't bring any enforcement action against these companies that suffered a disaster from CrowdStrike. And we're left with there are no regulations to be able to hold companies accountable or get them to not fall for this yet again at some point in the future. And that's really what gets me about this whole mess with cybersecurity and internal accounting controls. And okay, it's a stretch to use them that way to hold companies accountable, but we got to do something. And now a judge has just said we can't do that. And I don't know that there is any clear way to do anything else.
Yeah, are there any solutions being worked out there, or is it just like, hey, cybersecurity, do better, please, because we got nothing?
Like, kind of, sort of. So in theory, the Federal Trade Commission could bring enforcement actions if you have poor cybersecurity that exposes consumer data. Well, that's not what happened with CrowdStrike, because they don't collect customer data, and your customer data wasn't exposed. You just had a system crash. So the Federal Trade Commission can't do it. The chief cybersecurity regulator, quote unquote, in this country is CISA, but CISA doesn't actually have enforcement powers. They can only recommend that you do certain things. So they're not going to be able to do it. Now, in theory, the SEC could adopt a new rule to say that companies must also have effective cybersecurity controls and update it and address the judge's point that no, you can't use accounting to enforce on cybersecurity. So the SEC could maybe adopt a new rule, except, there's going to be a lot of excepts here.
Sure.
Is that now somebody somewhere will haul the SEC into court to say, no, you can't do that. You don't have the authority to regulate cybersecurity. You're an investor protection agency. And because the Supreme Court has now struck down what has been known as Chevron deference, where a judge must respect a regulator's effort to make a good regulation. Judges no longer have to do that. They'll probably find a judge who's just going to say, no, you can't regulate cybersecurity. So it will take an act of Congress.
Cool.
And yeah, you're like, yeah, sure, awesome. That's totally coming by like next week. Yeah, absolutely. So there really is no effective way for us to address what is a clear, known, pressing, and specific risk to companies all over the place. And if I can keep going on my soapbox, like
Here we go. This is what I was waiting for.
If I were Vladimir Putin, I would be looking at this and taking detailed notes, because we have basically just told all of our adversaries, you can run right over us in cybersecurity. You already did it with SolarWinds, and we have just decided to lay down our arms and not hold companies accountable to be able to be sure that this doesn't happen again, when it already happened again with the CrowdStrike disaster.
Today's episode of Off the Books is brought to you by Workiva. In today's world, musicians can make money in several ways. And while it may seem simple, it's actually quite complicated. Seriously, just Google how musicians make money. For the sake of time, we'll only mention a few. Live performances, merch, and streaming royalties. And while there are always exceptions, most artists aren't making a living redoing their work. But, as you might have guessed, we're here to discuss an exception. Recently, one musician's been seeing success redoing her work. You might know her all too well. These re-recorded albums are making quite the splash in the music industry, breaking new records, re-engaging fans, and making that money. But repetitive work in your audit and risk processes simply isn't benefiting you, is it, dear listener? If you're wasting valuable time chasing down evidence requests or manually updating SaaS reports, then it's time to discover what Workiva can do for you. Automate all that awful stuff so you can spend more time on value-added work. Audit and risk teams plus Workiva? It's a love story. Just go to workiva.com/risk. That's WORKIVA.com/risk and say yes.
What if you're a company? What should you be doing right now if you're an internal audit team, knowing that these big problems have happened before? What should we be thinking about?
Well, what they should be doing after they stop banging their head against the wall, because that's clearly what I would do if I were a CISO or an internal auditor. I mean, at a fundamental level, this is no longer really about compliance. This is an operational risk, so airlines that could not get airplanes off the ground for 5 days, they lost a horrendous amount of money. So if internal audit or compliance went to the board to say, well, the good news is we're not going to get a regulatory fine, Who cares? You couldn't get planes up. That's like you're an airline. You have one job, and they couldn't do it. I think internal auditors would still they should look long and hard at what their IT general controls are to be able to deal with these threats coming from outside your immediate enterprise. They're coming from your extended enterprise of these technology providers. And they pump out updates all the time. Now, the fact is, we absolutely know these updates can be risky. And you absolutely could create a safe zone if we're going to install it on this PC here first, this sandbox system, and we're going to play with it there to see, can we play in the sandbox or not? And if we can, then we'll roll it out enterprise-wide. That absolutely is what they should do. That clearly is not what they had done before. You really do need to pay much more attention to what your IT general controls are in this broader realm of an extended enterprise. And anybody who thinks IT general controls are just about a SOX compliance audit and it's just about the financials and is it material or not, like, spare me, dude. Look at what has just happened. This is clearly an immediate operational risk, and that's where you need to start thinking about how IT general controls work or they don't. And a lot of companies still, they don't work as well as they need to.
I have a kind of out-of-the-box pitch, is we wait for a judicial conference, so they're all flying, and then we push out bad code on purpose, and so they're all stuck in airports for days. And then they'll be like, oh, we're wrong. We should probably have some sort of enforcement.
I don't know, Mike. I was stuck in airports, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. I was living CrowdStrike when it happened.
Yes.
Well, that's the difference between you and Mike.
Yeah. Well,
I wish it on a lot of people. Not you.
Well, thank you. You probably have reason to wish it on me.
To get back to your question about what could internal auditors do, I mean, you can easily talk to the board to say, this is a clear and present operational danger. They're going to get that. And you could also say, this transcends whether this is or isn't a compliance risk. They're going to get that too, because the business isn't working. And I do think you have a natural audience now to be able to make arguments that we need to pay much more attention to how we are using technology providers, how are we overseeing that use, how are we interacting with them, because it's not that they just provide one static service. They are updating the service they provide all the time in these software upgrades. What are those upgrades? Where are they coming from? Who's testing them? And it becomes a much easier argument to make that we have to pay more attention there when you frame it as a risk concern, not just a compliance concern.
Well, and it's easy enough for us to talk about this, here on the stage in a podcast and theoretical, but one of the things I'm wondering is, practically, this type of software, SaaS software, generally speaking, these updates are ubiquitous, right? Constantly happening. I'm trying to think of the infrastructure that you would need in order to sort of do as you would suggest, put it in a sandbox, kind of play with it. Could there not be maybe a way to push that back on the providers, almost like a SOC report, kind of? Hey, we've sort of gone through this, these are the checks, this is good. There's almost some inherent liability, if they were to screw it up. I'm just thinking about this having a dramatic infrastructural and process implications here.
That's a fair point. And I like the idea of trying to push the responsibility back onto the provider, because ultimately it should be their responsibility to put out clean code. As a practical matter, we still have lawyers in corporate legal departments who are going to say, well, are we ever really sure that we can trust them, or will we ultimately have to do this ourselves? And I think they will say, ultimately, we also have to put a good seal of approval on this update that's coming into our system. But it does also mean that internal audit really should work much more closely with the CISO to say, you know as well as I do, this is a big problem, and we have to solve it somehow. And we can't just rely on the good word of the providers. We're going to work with the providers closely, and internal auditors absolutely should be talking with the providers about where does this software come from? What is the process? I'm all for a good SOC 2 report, but at the end of the day, still, companies will need to fend for themselves, because there's always going to be the corporate legal teams saying, we're never going to be 100% sure unless we do it ourselves. It's going to mean a lot of close collaboration between the CISO, internal audit, between those providers, getting the right testing spelled out, getting the right documentation, and constant monitoring of who is getting these updates. What if they accidentally push it out to somebody in the Peoria office and they implement it before it goes through the sandbox testing? And if there are listeners in Peoria, they're going to be upset about that. But okay. I mean, it is a complex challenge, that is for sure.
So you've been coming to Amplify for a long time. Any advice for people who are here or trying to make the most of a conference like this?
Oh, I mean, honestly, this is going to sound corny, and Workiva's not paying me to say this. You can't really go wrong with whatever you do at the conference, because I don't come here with many specific plans about exactly where I'm going to go, and I tend to wander into a bunch of different sessions. They're always going to be very informative. I have found that whatever your particular need is, you want to see a product demo, you can see a product demo. You just want to hear corporations talking about, here's our challenge, here's how we're doing it, and Workiva helps us, but even aside from the Workiva angle, they bring really good, thoughtful discussion about, here's the challenge we have, and here's how we know we're going to have to solve that somehow. How we get there, this is what we're trying, and there's a lot of good conversation, and the food and the drink is also good.
Well, Matt Kelly, thank you so much for wandering on to our stage once again this year.
Always happy to wander around the Workiva conference and see what's going on.
No, it's great having you back. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again to Matt Kelly, and thank you, dear listener, for surfing along with us. I'm Catherine Tsai, that was Mike Gravano and Steve Soder, and this has been Off the Books presented by Workiva.
Please subscribe. By golly, leave us a review, and gosh darn it, tell your buddies if you like the show. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, we would love for you to leave us a note in the comments, or feel free to drop us a line at offthebooks@workiva.com. Surf's up, and we'll see you on the next wave.